Do you understand what you're going to try to do? Okay, here we go. Okay, that's all. You all can go back to your seats now. You served my purpose, all right? Thank you. Can I tell you what I was trying to illustrate by that silly activity? It's a very common trick of the devil. Have you heard this idea that the liberals are like the Sadducees and the conservatives are like the Pharisees? Have you ever heard anyone try to make an analogy like that? The devil would like to change the way we find truth from looking at the data to looking at the populace. And the devil would like to lead us to conclude, to get us to choose the way we live on the basis of avoiding extremes. So in a way, I almost talk to myself like this. I am not an extremist. I am not an extremist. And the way we try to stay in the middle of the road is by making sure that we don't go to either extreme. Can you follow what I'm communicating right now, the idea? It becomes a balancing act. The way we choose our life becomes a balancing act. But can you just see, just by the illustration, that a balancing act is not a stable way of determining your positions? Because all the devil has to manipulate, all he has to do to manipulate me, if he wants me to move to the right, all he has to do is bring some right extremist and put them out there in my field of vision. And then I'll feel a little bit left of center. Or if he wants to move me to the left, he can bring some left extremist or a bunch more people on the left. And as they're way out there, I'll feel a little bit right of center. And it really becomes very easy to just move me around. People who choose their values like this, moving from one part of the country to another, is often a shock to their value system. Because you follow the idea. You're in Luke 18, aren't you? Look at verse 11. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. God, I thank thee that I am not, what's it say? As other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. Can you see the irony in this idea? For a man to say that, Father, I thank thee that I am not like the Sadducee, and I'm not like this Pharisee, and in saying it, to be just like the Pharisee in the parable. What did the Pharisee in the parable do? He evaluated the correctness of his own position and experience, his religious experience, on the basis of distancing himself from those that he knew to be wrong in their experience. And we can't do it. It's just a trick. I've said it so many ways, I don't know how to make it more clear. I'm moving on. Our fifth trick we're talking about, I call it the authorities disagree trick. Do you remember that? It talks about this in the Bible. In fact, let's look at one of the places. Look at John chapter 9. John chapter 9. And we're looking at verse 16. John 9 and verse 16. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, this man is not of God. That would be Jesus. Because he keeps not the Sabbath day. Others said, how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was, what's it say? Can I explain to you how this trick worked with the people in the time of Jesus and how it works today? I talked last night about how the devil likes to lead us to think in a very inferior way about our own minds. How he does this with a large part of the populace. Because, you remember why we talked about that last night? It's not because he wants us to be humble. It's because he wants us to be dependent on someone else. The devil doesn't like humility, but he does like it when, by guiding one man, he can move 10. this trick is related. The devil tells people that people have been arguing about this topic for centuries. Great men have been talking about it. Have you ever heard anyone ever talk about an argument like this? I think one of the most famous ones, and I'm not even going to get into the details of it, but use it as an illustration, is the nature of Christ. When I was a child, I heard people talk about how there have been arguments in the church about this topic for 100 years. And the devil is trying to communicate something in that sentence, not so much about the nature of Christ, as about how I find truth. If the great, big, smart people can't agree, then there's no sense in me even studying the topic. That's a trick. As if God can't write things in such a way that we can understand them. Yeah, so part of the authorities disagree trick is just that. It's the idea that because even the elders in the church can't agree on this issue that's dividing the church, therefore it's kind of hopeless for me, the housewife, to get it. Do you understand? That's just an application of the very same trick. It really isn't true that the reason that people don't agree is because the data is so shady. Rarely is that it. James 4 says something different. It says that the wars and arguments among you come because people are serving their appetites, their passions, and their desires. That's the normal thing. I don't mean there isn't anything that's truly confusing, but you understand the trick. There's another part of this authorities disagree trick. You might call it the informed and intelligent judge trick. Almost I could have just been using it with you, this trick. People do use this with each other. For example, if I was, lecturing on whether or not it's a good idea to eat fish, if I talked like this, that some studies have been done that have shown that the fish has omega-3 oils that dramatically increase our ability to deal with depression and with stresses. But on the other hand, the studies in this part of Washington have shown that heavy metals from industry have begun really filling the fish and making them a real threat to our health. And then if I would say something like, but what the researchers have missed is, and then I share some other point. There is something I've said without using any words. I've said that I am a well-read person. I've read the studies on this side of the argument. I've read the studies on that side of the argument. I have evaluated them both. And since I've read them all thoroughly, I am the informed and intelligent judge. And you ought to believe what I have to say since I've already evaluated all the data. But that is just another version of the authorities disagree trick. Only in this trick, I'm making myself into the authority. And you fall for it terribly if you think that everyone who's read all the studies thinks the same as I do. As if my position is really based upon an objective consideration of all the data. I'm using too many big words to express a very simple thought. Let me just try to think of some other way to do it. The fact that someone else has studied something else, the fact that someone you know has studied a topic, doesn't really mean that you can trust them to be right on their conclusion. When I was teaching my very first year at Washita Hills Academy, teaching there, this was 1991, and some of you are old enough to remember what was going on in 1991. As if I'm an old man, that was so silly. And anyway, the one thing that was happening in 1991 was a lot of argument about tithe, about where tithe could or could not be spent or sent. And so here was my freshman Bible class at the academy, and their parents were really into this, and they weren't on the same side of the issue. Have you ever seen children whose parents were fighting? If they're 18, they often get along just great, but if they're 15, they often fight just like their parents do. I mean, it's just kind of interesting, this kind of thing. And so here were my students, and so I assigned them to write a research paper on the issue of tithe.